You need to listen to me right now.
It took less than 5 seconds for everything to change. In a quiet hospital corridor in downtown Chicago, a pregnant nurse named Emily Blackwood stood doing her job, steady hands, calm voice, focused on a patient who needed her. Then Daniel Hayes walked in, a self-made millionaire with a reputation for control, power, and a temper people whispered about, but never challenged. What happened next would leave an entire floor frozen in silence. In front of doctors, patients, and staff, Daniel raised his hand and slapped her. A pregnant woman, a nurse. No one stepped in. No one spoke. Because in that moment, everyone believed the same thing, that Daniel Hayes was untouchable. But what they didn't know was that Emily Blackwood was not alone in this world. And the man connected to her life would soon turn that moment into the biggest mistake Daniel Hayes had ever made. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. At first, it looked like a simple incident of power gone too far. A wealthy man losing his temper. A nurse caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But stories like this are never as simple as they seem. Because behind that single moment was a chain of events that had been building for years. And buried inside it was a truth that would force people to question everything they thought they understood about power, influence, and consequence. Who was Daniel Hayes really when the cameras weren't on him and the business deals were closed? And more importantly, who was Emily Blackwood beyond the quiet professionalism everyone saw every day? There was something about her that didn't fit the usual pattern. The way she handled pressure. The way she stayed calm even when others panicked. It was as if she had seen worse. Lived through something deeper, something that shaped her into someone who didn't react the way most people would. And that was the first detail that made this story different. Emily Blackwood was known among her colleagues as dependable, precise, and unusually composed. At 32, she had already built a reputation in one of the busiest hospitals in Chicago's West Side. She worked long shifts without complaint, often taking on extra responsibilities even while expecting her first child. Her co-workers admired her, but knew very little about her personal life. She never talked about her family, never shared stories about where she came from, and avoided attention whenever possible. To most people, she was simply a dedicated nurse preparing for motherhood. But there were moments, small and easy to overlook, that hinted at something else. A quiet confidence, a refusal to be intimidated, a calmness that didn't match the stress of her environment. It was the kind of presence that made people trust her without fully understanding why. Daniel Hayes, on the other hand, was impossible to ignore. At 46, he had built a multi-million-dollar real estate empire across several states, earning both admiration and resentment in equal measure. He was known for his sharp instincts, aggressive negotiations, and a belief that success justified his methods. Employees described him as demanding. Business partners called him brilliant but difficult, and those who had crossed him rarely spoke about it more than once. Daniel believed in control. He believed that power was something you demonstrated, something people had to feel when they were in the same room as you. And over time, that belief shaped the way he treated everyone around him, especially those he considered beneath him. The day their paths collided began like any other. Emily was assigned to monitor a patient recovering from a cardiac procedure, carefully following hospital protocol to ensure stability. Daniel had arrived unexpectedly, frustrated about delays in his own treatment schedule and already irritated before stepping onto the floor. When he approached the nurse's station, his tone made it clear he expected immediate attention. Emily responded the way she always did, calmly explaining the situation and the necessary steps required before any adjustments could be made. It was a simple interaction, one that should have ended within seconds. But something about her composure unsettled him. She didn't rush. She didn't apologize unnecessarily. She didn't react to his impatience the way others usually did. And for Daniel Hayes, that felt like resistance.
Right now.
What followed was a slow escalation that no one fully stopped. His voice grew louder. Her tone remained steady. Staff members nearby exchanged glances but stayed silent, unsure of how far things would go. Then came the moment that would define everything that followed. In a sudden movement, driven by anger and ego, Daniel raised his hand and struck her across the face. The sound echoed louder than anyone expected. And just like that, Time seemed to stop. Emily didn't cry. She didn't shout. She simply steadied herself, placed a hand gently over her stomach, and looked directly at him. Then she said something that would linger in the minds of everyone who heard it. She told him, quietly, that he shouldn't have done that. What made that moment so unsettling wasn't just the act itself. It was her reaction, or rather, the lack of one. People expected fear. They expected outrage. Instead, they saw control. And that control created questions no one could answer at the time. Within minutes, the whispers started. Quiet at first, then spreading from one corner of the floor to the other. Nurses pulling each other aside. A doctor checking something on his phone. Someone asking a question that didn't get answered right away. Did you see her reaction? Why wasn't she scared? Who is she? And then, something small happened, something easy to miss, but important. One of the older staff members, a man who had worked in that hospital for over 20 years, suddenly went quiet while looking at Emily's name on a chart. He stared at it longer than necessary, his expression slowly changing from confusion to recognition. He didn't say anything immediately, but when he finally did, his voice was lower than usual. Careful, like he wasn't sure who might hear him. He asked if anyone knew her full name. Not just Emily, but the last name too. And when someone answered, Blackwood, the room shifted again. Because for most people, it meant nothing. Just another name. But for him, it meant something else entirely. He stepped back slightly, almost as if distancing himself from the situation without realizing it. Then he said something that didn't sound like a question. It sounded like a warning. If she's who I think she is, then this isn't going to end the way he thinks it will. Emily Blackwood, meanwhile, had already returned to her duties as if nothing had happened. She checked on her patient, adjusted the 4-line, reviewed the chart, and spoke in the same calm, reassuring tone she always used. If anyone had walked onto the floor at that moment, they wouldn't have guessed she had just been publicly humiliated minutes earlier. But those who had witnessed it couldn't stop watching her. Not because they expected her to break, but because she wasn't breaking at all, and that made them uneasy in a way they couldn't put into words. By the end of that day, something had shifted. Calls were being made behind closed doors. Names were being mentioned in hushed conversations. And somewhere beyond the hospital, a man who rarely involved himself in public matters had just learned what happened to his sister. His name was Michael Blackwood, and unlike Daniel Hayes, Michael didn't need to prove his power, because the kind of power he held didn't come from wealth alone. It came from reach, from connections, and from a reputation built on results that people didn't question twice. And as the reality of what had happened began to unfold, one thing became clear. Daniel Hayes hadn't just made a mistake. He had crossed a line that could not be undone. Michael Blackwood was not a name that appeared in headlines or business magazines, yet within certain circles, it carried a weight that people understood immediately. He had spent years building influence in ways that were quiet but far-reaching, moving through industries where decisions were made behind closed doors and outcomes were shaped long before the public ever became aware. Unlike men like Daniel Hayes, Michael did not rely on visibility to establish authority. He operated with precision, choosing when to step forward and when to remain unseen. Those who worked with him described him as measured, calculating, and deeply protective of the few people he trusted. And at the center of that small circle was his younger sister, Emily Blackwood. Emily had never asked for protection. In fact, she had spent most of her adult life doing the opposite, creating distance between herself and the world her brother navigated. She chose nursing because it gave her something real, something grounded in service rather than influence. She believed in earning respect through work, not through connections. And Michael respected that choice, even if he never stopped watching from a distance. He made sure she had what she needed without interfering in the life she had built. To most people, Emily Blackwood was simply a nurse. But to Michael, she was the only person who reminded him of who he had been before power became part of his identity. And that was not something he took lightly. When news of the incident reached him, it didn't come through the hospital administration or official reports. It came through a network that functioned quietly but efficiently, passing along information that mattered before it could be controlled or rewritten. The message was brief, direct, and enough to change the direction of his entire day. For a moment, those closest to him noticed something rare. Silence. Not the kind that comes from hesitation, but the kind that signals a decision has already been made. Michael didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. He simply confirmed the details, stood up, and gave a single instruction that set everything in motion. Upstairs, Emily stepped into a quieter part of the hallway and looked at her phone. Missed calls. Messages waiting. One name standing out among the rest. She didn't rush to respond. She didn't panic. She just looked at it, knowing exactly what it meant. Because the moment she returned that call, everything that had been quiet would stop being quiet. She stood there for a few seconds longer than necessary, her eyes fixed on the screen, her expression unchanged. Around her, the hospital continued moving, nurses walking past, equipment rolling down the hallway, voices blending into the background. But for Emily Blackwood, everything had narrowed to that one decision. Returning that call would not just inform someone of what had happened. It would activate a chain of events she had spent years avoiding. A part of her life she had deliberately kept separate from who she had become. And for a brief moment, she hesitated. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. Because once certain people get involved, things don't stay small. When she finally moved, it wasn't rushed. Her fingers tapped the screen, and she lifted the phone to her ear. The line connected almost immediately, as if the person on the other end had been waiting. She didn't need to explain everything. She didn't need to dramatize it. Her voice remained calm as she said his name and told him what happened. There was a pause on the other end. Not long, but long enough to feel different. And then a single question came through. Not about her condition. Not about the hospital. Just one question. Who was it? Emily answered without hesitation. Daniel Hayes. There was no reaction. No raised voice. No immediate response. Just silence again. And then, quietly, the call ended. No reassurance. No instructions. Nothing that would suggest what was about to happen next. But Emily didn't call back. She didn't need to. Because she understood something most people didn't. Silence from someone like her brother wasn't uncertainty. It was action already in motion. Daniel Hayes didn't think about the slap for more than a few seconds after it happened. By the time he walked out of that hospital floor, he was already smiling again, adjusting his cufflinks, taking a call, speaking like nothing had happened. To him, it was just another moment, another outburst, another situation that would disappear the way they always did. He stepped outside, got into his car, and told his driver to head to his office. There were deals to close, meetings to attend, numbers to move. His world didn't pause for things like that. And as far as he was concerned, it never would. But something strange happened before he even reached his office. His phone buzzed, then buzzed again, and again. At first, he ignored it. Calls could wait. Messages could wait. But the notifications didn't stop. One after another, stacking up faster than usual. That was the first sign. Small, easy to dismiss, but different. When he finally picked up the phone, the first message he opened didn't make sense. It was from one of his senior partners. Short, direct. We need to pause the deal. Daniel frowned slightly, reading it again. Pause. That wasn't language they used. Not on something that had already been finalized. He immediately called back, expecting a quick explanation. But the call didn't connect. Straight to voicemail. That was unusual. He tried another contact. Same result. Now his expression began to tighten. Just slightly. By the time he reached his office building, the situation had already started changing. Not dramatically, not loudly, but fast. His assistant met him at the door, her face different from usual. Less confident, less certain. She tried to speak, but paused, as if choosing her words carefully. That alone irritated him. He asked what was going on. She hesitated, then said investors were pulling back. Not one, not two, multiple. Daniel stopped walking. For a second, he thought he heard her wrong. Investors didn't just pull out without warning. Not from him. Not from deals that were already secured. That wasn't how things worked. He walked straight into his office and grabbed his tablet, pulling up his company dashboard. And that was when he saw it. The numbers were dropping. Not slowly. Not gradually. Sharp. Immediate. Stocks that had been stable that morning were now sliding in a way that didn't make sense. Notifications kept coming in. Emails. Alerts. Calls. One deal suspended. Another under review. Another withdrawn completely. Daniel stared at the screen, his jaw tightening as he tried to process what he was seeing. This wasn't normal market behavior. This wasn't coincidence. This was coordinated. He picked up his phone again and started calling aggressively now. This time, people answered. But the conversations were different. Shorter. Careful. One of his longtime associates finally said something that made everything pause for a second. "I think you need to look into what happened this morning." Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. "What does that have to do with anything?" There was a pause on the other end. Then the response came, quieter than expected. "Everything." The line went dead. Now the confusion started turning into something else. Not fear yet, but pressure. The kind that builds when things stop making sense. He went back to the screen. Numbers still falling. More alerts coming in. His assistant knocked again, this time with less hesitation. She told him another major partner had just backed out. No explanation given. That was when it hit him. This wasn't random. Something had triggered this. Something connected all of it. And for the first time since he left that hospital, his mind went back to that moment. The slap, the silence, her face, and the way she looked at him. Daniel leaned back slowly, staring at nothing for a few seconds as the pieces began trying to connect. Because deep down, he knew this kind of reaction didn't come from nowhere. People didn't just walk away from money. Not like this. Not all at once. There was a reason. There was always a reason. He just didn't know it yet. And that was the most dangerous part. Daniel Hayes sat there for a moment longer, staring at the screen as the numbers kept falling, trying to force logic into something that refused to make sense. His entire career had been built on control, on understanding cause and effect, on knowing exactly which move would trigger which reaction. But this didn't follow any pattern he recognized. There was no warning, no negotiation, no visible pressure. Just a sudden shift, like the ground beneath him had quietly been pulled away. He stood up abruptly, pacing once across the office before stopping again, his mind going back to the only unusual thing that had happened that day. The hospital, the nurse, the slap. He exhaled slowly, almost dismissing it again, because in his world, moments like that didn't carry consequences. Not real ones. Not ones that could touch him like this. But the timing refused to be ignored. His phone rang again, and this time he answered immediately. It was his financial advisor, and the tone alone told him everything was getting worse. The man didn't waste time with greetings. He went straight to the point, saying the sell-offs weren't isolated anymore. They were spreading. Other firms were reacting, adjusting positions, creating a ripple effect that was now impossible to contain. Daniel asked the only question that mattered. Why? But the answer he got wasn't clear. It wasn't detailed. It was careful. The advisor said there were concerns being raised. Concerns about reputation, about risk, about association. Words that sounded vague, but carried weight in the kind of circles Daniel operated in. And then he added something else, something that made Daniel stop pacing completely. He said, "This isn't coming from the market, it's coming from people." Daniel lowered the phone slowly after the call ended, the silence in the office now heavier than before. People. That meant intention. That meant choice. That meant someone had decided this should happen. And if someone had decided it, then it could be traced back. He just needed to find the source. He turned back to his desk, pulling up more detailed reports, scanning through movements, connections, timelines, trying to spot the origin of the shift. But everything pointed in the same direction. It all started after he left that hospital. Not before. Not during. After. That was the trigger point. That was when everything changed. Another knock came at the door, sharper this time. His assistant stepped in again, her composure now almost gone. She told him that a major banking partner had requested an emergency review of their relationship. That alone was enough to send a clear message. Banks didn't act like that unless there was something serious behind it. Daniel nodded slowly, dismissing her, but his mind was no longer on the numbers. It was on the connection he had been trying to ignore. Because now it was no longer just a possibility. It was the only explanation left. He walked back to the window, looking out over the city he had spent years building his influence in, and for the first time, it didn't feel like his anymore. There was a distance now, a separation he couldn't close. He reached for his phone again, scrolling through contacts, stopping on one name. The hospital administrator. If there was anything to understand, anything at all, it would start there. He pressed call and waited, his jaw tight, his patience thinner than it had been all day. When the line finally connected, he didn't bother with introductions. He asked directly what had been reported about the incident. There was a pause on the other end, longer than necessary, before the administrator responded. The man said the situation had been documented and escalated, that it was no longer internal, that external parties had already been informed. Daniel's grip tightened again as he asked who those external parties were. Another pause, and then the answer came, careful but clear enough. People who take these matters seriously. That wasn't enough. Not for him. Not when everything he had built was starting to fracture in real time. He ended the call without another word. Frustration now mixing with something he hadn't felt in a long time. Uncertainty. The kind that doesn't come from risk, but from not knowing where the risk is coming from. By the next morning, it was no longer something he could explain away as temporary instability. Entire contracts had been frozen. A major acquisition he had spent months building collapsed in less than 12 hours. Calls that used to be returned within minutes were now ignored completely. People who once needed him no longer did. Daniel stood in his office, phone in hand, calling the same contacts repeatedly, but now the responses had changed. They were no longer polite, no longer respectful. They were distant, careful, almost afraid to be associated with him. That was when he realized something far more serious was happening. This wasn't panic. This was avoidance. Deliberate avoidance. Someone had drawn a line around him, and everyone else had stepped back. He turned to his assistant, his voice sharper now, demanding real answers. Not guesses, not assumptions. He wanted names. He wanted reasons. And for the first time since she had started working for him, she hesitated in a way that made the room feel smaller. Then she said it. There's a name that keeps coming up. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't say it immediately. She looked unsure, like even mentioning it carried weight. When she finally spoke, it was quieter than anything else she had said that day. Michael Blackwood. The room went still. Daniel didn't react right away. But this time, the name landed differently. Not vaguely familiar. Recognizable. Clear. He had heard it before. Not in conversations meant for him, but in conversations that happened above him. In rooms where decisions were made without needing approval. In situations where outcomes were already decided before discussions even began. And suddenly, everything made sense. The speed. The coordination. The silence. This wasn't chaos. This was control. Daniel felt something shift inside him then. Not anger. Not yet. Something heavier. Something closer to realization. He asked where Emily Blackwood lived. The question came out slower this time. More measured. Because now he understood this had never been random. He didn't go to his office the next day. He didn't take calls. He didn't check the markets. For the first time in years, Daniel Hayes stopped moving forward and started looking back. He drove himself to the hospital. No driver. No assistant. No presence. Just him. When he got there, everything looked normal. Nurses moving. Patients being attended to. Conversations happening like nothing had changed. But for him, everything had changed. He asked for Emily Blackwood. At first, they didn't want to give him information. That alone said enough. The way people looked at him now, it was different. Not respectful. Not welcoming. Just cautious. Eventually, he found out she wasn't there. She had taken leave. That was when the weight of what he had done settled in deeper. Not because someone told him, but because he could see the absence. He stood there for a moment longer, then turned and left. Because now, there was only one place left to go. Finding Michael Blackwood wasn't easy. Men like him don't have public schedules. They don't appear where people expect them. They don't make themselves available. But influence leaves traces. And Daniel followed them. Through connections that barely spoke to him anymore. Through conversations that ended quickly. Through doors that didn't fully open. Until finally, he got a location. No invitation. No confirmation. Just a place. When Daniel arrived, he didn't walk in like he used to. There was no confidence in his steps this time. No control. Just urgency. He was led inside without questions, without delay, like his arrival had already been expected. And when he saw Michael Blackwood, everything in him paused. Michael wasn't doing anything. He was just sitting there. Calm. Composed. Unmoved. The kind of presence that doesn't need to prove power because it already holds it. Daniel took a step forward, then another, and for a moment, it looked like he was about to speak the way he always did. But he didn't. Because this time, he knew exactly where he stood. His voice, when it finally came out, wasn't strong. I didn't know. The words felt small the moment he said them. Michael didn't respond. He just looked at him. And that silence broke something. Daniel stepped closer. Faster this time. The control he had been holding on to slipping completely. I didn't know who she was. I didn't know. He stopped himself. Because even he could hear it. It didn't matter. And in that moment, Daniel Hayes did something no one had ever seen him do before. He dropped. Right there. On his knees. Not for negotiation. Not for strategy. But because for the first time in his life, he understood he had nothing left to stand on. Daniel stayed on his knees longer than he expected to. At first, it felt unreal, like his body had moved before his mind could catch up. But as the silence stretched, it became something else entirely. Heavy. Final. There was no performance in it, no calculation, no audience to impress. Just a man who had spent his life standing above others, now unable to stand at all. His hands rested loosely at his sides, his shoulders no longer carrying the confidence they once did. When he finally tried to speak, his voice came out uneven, stripped of everything that once made people listen without question. He said he made a mistake. Then he stopped. Because for the first time in his life, that word felt too small for what he had done. He tried again, slower this time, saying it should never have happened, that he was ready to make it right, ready to take responsibility, ready to do whatever it took. But even as the words left his mouth, something inside him was already collapsing. Because deep down, he knew this wasn't something he could fix with promises. Not this time. Not here. Not in front of a man who had already taken everything from him without raising his voice. Michael Blackwood didn't interrupt. He didn't react. He just watched him, calm, steady, unmoved. And that stillness, it did more damage than anger ever could. Because it left Daniel alone with his own words. Alone with the truth of what he had become in that moment at the hospital. When Michael finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that settled into the room instantly. He said understanding something after it happens doesn't change the moment itself. It doesn't undo the damage. It doesn't take back the fear someone felt when they realized they were completely powerless in front of you. Daniel's head dropped slightly, his breath heavier now, not from panic, but from realization. That word, powerless, it echoed in his mind in a way nothing else had. Because for the first time, he wasn't thinking about himself. He was seeing that moment from her side. And there was no version of it that made him look anything other than what he had been. He asked again, but this time his voice was barely above a whisper. What can I do? Not to fix his company, not to restore his name, but to face what he had done. And that question, it was different now. Stripped of pride, stripped of control, real. Michael leaned forward just slightly, his eyes never leaving Daniel. He said this was never about destroying him. If it were, Daniel wouldn't be sitting there asking questions. Everything he had built would have disappeared without warning. Completely. Instead, this was restraint. Measured. Intentional. Because the goal was never to end him. It was to make sure he felt something he had never allowed anyone else to feel before. Then he said it. Slowly. Clearly. Helpless. The word landed harder than anything else. Because Daniel understood it instantly. Michael continued, saying power is not proven by how much control you have when people are watching. It's revealed in the exact moment you believe no one can stop you, and you choose what kind of person you're going to be anyway. And that was the moment Daniel failed. Not because he didn't know better, but because he believed he would never be held to it. The silence that followed felt different now. Not tense, not uncertain, just final. Daniel didn't move right away. He stayed there, letting everything settle, every word, every realization, every consequence. Because there was nothing left to argue. Nothing left to defend. For the first time in his life, there was no version of the story where he came out in control. When Michael spoke again, his tone softened slightly, but not in sympathy. In clarity. He said if Daniel truly wanted to make things right, it wouldn't start in that room. It wouldn't start with him. It would start with her. Not with words meant to ease his conscience, but with actions that didn't need to be seen, praised, or forgiven. Because forgiveness was never something he could demand. Daniel nodded slowly, his throat tight, the weight of that truth settling deeper than anything he had lost. Then, after a long pause, he pushed himself up from the ground. Not quickly, not confidently, but deliberately, like a man learning how to stand again without the power he used to rely on. He didn't try to speak again, because now he understood, words were the weakest thing he had left. When he turned and walked out, something followed him. Not fear, not anger, something heavier. Something that wouldn't fade with time. The understanding that for all the power he once had, there had been a moment where he used it on someone who had none. The consequences didn't disappear after that day. His business didn't suddenly recover. His reputation didn't quietly return. The distance people created around him remained. Deals stayed closed. Doors stayed partially shut. Because some things don't reset just because someone realizes they were wrong. But something else began to change. Slowly, quietly, in ways that didn't need attention. Daniel stopped speaking over people. He stopped forcing outcomes. He started listening, even when there was nothing to gain. Not because it rebuilt his image, but because for the first time, he understood what it felt like to be on the other side of power. Weeks later, when Emily Blackwood returned to the hospital, nothing about her demanded attention. She didn't walk in expecting sympathy. She didn't carry what happened like a performance. She simply returned to her work the same way she always had. Quiet, focused, unshaken in a way that didn't need to be explained. When Daniel finally saw her again, it wasn't planned. There were no cameras, no audience, just a moment that neither of them could avoid. He approached her slowly, not as a man trying to reclaim control, but as someone who understood he had none in that moment. He apologized. No long speech, no explanation, no attempt to defend himself, just the truth. And when he finished, he didn't ask for anything in return, because now he knew. Forgiveness is not something power can take. Michael Blackwood never appeared again. He didn't need to, because the moment Daniel understood, everything that needed to happen already had. And in the end, what stayed with people wasn't the slap. It wasn't even the downfall that followed. It was the realization that power doesn't protect who you are, it reveals it. And sometimes, the moment you think you're untouchable is the exact moment everything about you is exposed. And if this story stayed with you, don't forget to like and subscribe, because the next one might change how you see everything.